Supporting Europe's defense industry is a key goal, yet the competing national interests and funding issues could pose a challenge to realizing this ambition. Now, with the US changing its stance on its involvement in European security, the EU is considering using frozen Russian assets to finance support for Ukraine and its own defense industry in face of increasing tensions. Joining me now to discuss this is Tomasz Włostowski, managing partner at the EU Strategies.
Hello, how are you?
Good evening and welcome to the program. Thank you so much for joining. I would like to start by taking a look at a social media post that was posted on X by Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk. He said, I quote, "Enough talking, it's time to act. 1, let's finance our aid for Ukraine from the Russian frozen assets. 2, let's strengthen air policing, the Baltic Sentry and the EU borders with Russia. And finally, 3, let's swiftly adopt new fiscal rules to finance the EU security and defense now." So before touching the frozen Russian assets seemed to be a no-go, a big no-no. It posed many challenges. According to some, it was too complicated or even too risky. What has changed that the EU is now considering such move?
Well, obviously, what's changed is that the end of the war and the end of American support is on the horizon, right? So I think that's the key game changer right now, and Europe needs to start thinking how to finance the war, how to help Ukraine in the very short window that we have. Of course, we don't know how short the window is. We don't know how quickly President Trump wants to finish sort of U.S. involvement in this whole affair and in supporting Ukraine. But there's a clear sense in Europe and in Brussels in particular that the time is running out. So we need to really revisit all the options that we've discarded before and find any ways we can to support Ukraine. And of course, having these billions of Russian assets is sort of a natural direction to go because A, there's a lot of money that we have. 2, it's Russian money, and who's to blame for all the damage and for all the destruction and for all the deaths in Ukraine? It's the Russians. So obviously, using Russian assets to do that would be sort of a natural way to go. There have been legal sort of problems raised with confiscating these assets and using it for Ukraine reconstruction, but I think sort of the patience with the lawyers in finding a way to use them is running thin.
So do you think it is possible to quickly put in place some sort of a legislation that would actually allow the use of those frozen assets? What kind of procedures are we looking at that would have to be introduced to do so legally?
Well, I think we're looking at a couple of different issues. So the first issue is we've got frozen assets of the Russian Federation, of the Russian Central Bank. That's sort of one bulk of assets. And then we've got the sort of the private assets. So we've got the assets of Russian oligarchs, of Russian natural persons, politicians, executives, directors, business people, and so on. And we've got assets of Russian companies. So there's a clear distinction between the public assets and the private assets. There's a general feeling we shouldn't be using private assets because they're private. Although, if we think about whose assets have we frozen, these people, at least under EU law, are not exactly quote unquote innocent. I mean, there is a reason why we froze their assets, and the reason why we have frozen their assets is because they have been, in one way or another, involved in supporting or benefiting from the war, right? So these are not innocent people, after all, the people whose assets we've frozen. But that said, we're still sort of trying to avoid using these assets, and the whole focus is on the Russian government's assets. What would need to happen is basically we need to confiscate them. Now, legally, that's quite complicated. I think the much easier path would be to allow Ukrainian government or Ukrainian entities or Ukrainian people basically to file claims against these assets. That, at least in my personal view, I think that's much easier, because let's keep in mind that the assets that are frozen, we can already execute judgments against them. So if we have frozen assets of the Russian Federation or of Russian companies, and you come with a judgment from a court to execute against those assets, that's already possible right now. What we can't do, and we don't have right now, are the judgments against the Russians for the damage they've caused in Ukraine. So, it's a complicated issue how to circumvent that problem. And also the second thing is how to circumvent Russian sovereign immunity. It's a general concept in international public law that the assets of another government, of another country, are sort of immune from execution, from lawsuits. So we would need to sort of circumvent that problem, and I think that's some sort of a mental difficulty that most of the lawyers have.
It seems to be the case that upping the European security has to happen now, as the US is focusing on its own priorities, as we've seen from what's been happening in the US so far and internationally as well. Changes need to happen now. How long do you think it would take to have those frozen assets work for the EU defense, for supporting Ukraine? I mean, in the first minutes of our interview, you mentioned that we're working with a very short window.
Well, look, again, to be very frank, I find it difficult to imagine we're going to use the Russian assets for European defense. I mean, that is going to be, there are just too many hurdles for that, so I'm quite skeptical that is going to happen. I think what's much more likely to happen is finding some way of using those assets to help Ukraine rebuild or rearm itself. And that's probably sort of an easier path to go. Again, I think we're talking months and months. I mean, this is not going to happen in a week or 2 weeks. I mean, this is what we would need to do is pass legislation in Europe. That's number one. And number two, I'm suspecting we will not do that unless we have some type of a signal from the Russians that that's okay with them. I find it difficult to imagine that Europe would do it completely in light of complete Russian opposition. And what I'm getting at here is I think the proper way to go would be that the Americans, as part of their negotiations with the Russians, would agree with the Russians that some part of a global settlement and freeze or suspension of the war would also include Europeans using the frozen assets for reconstruction of Ukraine, because that would solve one of the big stumbling blocks in finding a peace that would be acceptable to Ukraine. Because one thing is cessation of hostilities, another issue is finding security guarantees for Ukraine, and the third prong is rebuilding Ukraine. And at least if the Russians agreed, or at least tacitly agreed, or signaled their agreement to using the frozen assets for that, we would solve at least one problem.
We've seen this plan, this very short but very concise plan from Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk on his X account, and we know that Poland actually holds the presidency over the EU Council. Do you think that these two things coming up together are actually capable of giving fruit to some results? Is Poland going to be that trigger that is going to push this whole procedure forward?
Well, absolutely. I think, and that's probably one of the reasons why the Prime Minister put that tweet out, because I think he does want to put the pressure, number one, on the High Representative, Kaja Kallas, and her External Action Service, who are sort of in charge of the foreign affairs and the sanctions file in Brussels, to sort of look at that. We know that Kaja Kallas, in general, she is quite supportive of using Russian assets. So the problem is not at the political level, the problem is on the technical, legal level. But I think to answer your question precisely, the answer is yes. Poland will definitely be pushing it, and it's in a key position to allow that to happen.
What do you think is going to be Donald Trump's stance on Europe actually wanting to use those frozen assets? Considering the conversations that he's having with Moscow, with Vladimir Putin, do you think he's going to support this idea, or maybe rather he's going to backtrack from it, depending on what Vladimir Putin actually is going to tell him?
Look, and this is the million-dollar question, which is what does Trump really want? And I'm not going to speculate on what he's actually after. I'm not really sure that he knows at this point what he's really after, to be honest. But I think the key point is this: the Americans want out. I think that's very clear. And some way of using Russian assets to achieve that is a way to sort of achieve both goals. On the one hand, if we solve this problem, and that's why I've mentioned it earlier, once we solve this problem, it's much easier for the Americans to extricate themselves from supporting Ukraine in this war. So naturally, I would imagine that Donald Trump should be supportive of it because it solves a couple of his problems. Now, the main issue, of course, is, as you suggested, whether Putin would agree or not. But we haven't seen Americans put any pressures on the Russians yet. I think this has been the main complaint, and this has been the main commentary, that there's a lot of concessions vis-a-vis the Ukrainians, and that the Ukrainians are supposed to undertake. We have not yet seen one element of putting the pressure on the Russians. So perhaps getting a Russian agreement to confiscate, to use those assets for reconstruction of Ukraine would be part of the puzzle.
Thank you so much, Tomasz Włostowski, Managing Partner at the EU Strategies. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
And so this would be all for now here on World News Tonight, but please do stay tuned. We're back in just a moment with more news and features.